And then I get a call from President Obama asking if I would please come home to chair his finance efforts on his reelection.
On his reelection.
So of course, and he was very sweet to be like, you don't have to say yes, no pressure. But I mean, you sort of have to say yes.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and I am interviewing someone that I admire a great deal today, Matthew Barzun, who is many things, and we'll explore some of that. Just before we started this, I was talking with Matt about his grandfather, Jacques Barzun, who taught at Columbia, who was a professor there, went there when he was 14 years old, kind of mistakenly, then went off and finished high school somewhere else and then came back to Columbia. Did Jacques Barzun stay at Columbia from then on, or did he do other things after he went there?
No, he really stayed with them up until in the history department, and then becoming provost in the late 1960s. Then he stayed on as university professor. And then I think he finally left sort of in the late 90s and spent the final chapter of his life, because he lived to almost 105.
Yeah.
Wonderful wife, Marguerite, down in her hometown of San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah. And, you know, you go in the book we're going to be talking about, you go into a lot of things about your family. So let me just introduce the book here. This is The Power of Giving Away Power. It is by Matt Barzun, who has enjoyed his own fair share of power in that he was ambassador to Sweden and then to the United Kingdom. I think fair to say, as a kind of a reward for being instrumental to helping Barack Obama get elected in a very practical way, you put together, as you described in some detail in the book, some of his more innovative fundraising, small donors and this kind of thing. Is that an accurate description of what you did with President Obama?
Sure. Yes. In the first campaign was a volunteer fundraiser and helped with a wonderful team here in Louisville. And I should say, Frank, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Skip that in talking about my grandfather. And so a group of us here in Louisville decided or took a leap and said, well, what if we approached fundraising more like we approach field organizing, which is to start face-to-face relationships really early in the process and let people invest small amounts, $10, $20 early.
Yeah.
The idea of giving small donations wasn't new, but it was usually done by email and it was done relatively late. And we wanted to do it face-to-face early because we thought real relationships could form there that could go on and yield good results. And so we did, and it did.
Yeah, there's an interesting incident in the book, and this is out of order here, but in the book, you talk about not a confrontation exactly, but a bit of an argument with one of his senior folks who did not really understand what you had done when you brought together a group of small donors. And
that's right.
They weren't taking this seriously. And it was basically, well, we're not going to do that. Just tell a little bit of that story.
Sure. Well, and so before he ran for president, he had come to Louisville, Kentucky. He was raising money for the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, and he had just been elected to the Senate. And I think he was trying to kind of prove that he was a good team player by raising money for the Senate. So anyway, long story short, he ends up coming, and so we agreed to do a sort of traditional fundraiser for him, starring him, but for the Senate. But I was like, look, it's pretty amazing to have someone like you come to our city. Would you please do something for free so everyone can appreciate? And he said, sure. And we didn't know if a couple hundred people would come, Frank, or more, but we nearly filled our minor league ballpark, Louisville Slugger Field. I think it was over 5,000 men, women, and kids came to hear him speak. It was really powerful. And my two colleagues who had helped organize that said to ourselves, looking out at this sea of sort of every zip code in our city and just a wonderful moment, how many of these people, if he does run for president, and we hoped he would, do you think would invest in the campaign early? So fast forward, he does run. He says, I'd love to come back to Louisville. We say, great. Our plan is to do test that question. How many of these people would invest? And then also do a traditional sort of higher dollar fundraiser. And then we get the call from the campaign saying good news and bad news. Good news is he's definitely coming in February. Bad news is he only has time for one event. So we're going to do the fancy one. And I hang up. I was like, no, we'll do the big one. at $20 and we'll cancel the other one. And all the people at the other one would be much more happy to come to the fun one, the big one. There's more energy there.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. So I hang up the phone and I am really depressed and I'm moping around our house. And my lovely wife, Brooke, is like, you need to get in a car or on a Southwest Airlines, fly up to Chicago, make your case. Because if they really did that, this is not the campaign you thought it was going to be, and you should not volunteer your time. So she's a wise woman. I did what she said. I go up, and it's David Plouffe, who became a great friend, and he's he was campaign manager. And so I didn't want to be one of those pushy campaign. I mean, sometimes politics brings out on both parties just sort of pushy types, and I was determined not to be one. But I wanted to go make my case. So I explained the situation. I was like, please let us do both. And he's like, yeah, man, but no. And he's like, you look really, and I started staring at my shoes or something. And he said, you look really bummed. And I was like, I am really bummed. And I'm also just kind of trying to figure out how I'm going to give back the 3,200 tickets. He's like, what do you mean? He's like, you've already sold 3,200 people who want to invest $20. I was like, yeah, that's why I'm here.
I'm talking with Matthew Barzun today about his book, The Power of Giving Away Power. And it's one that just got published. I think, when was the actual pub date?
June 1st of this year. So
yeah, so I got a copy. I think I got the Kindle copy the day of, when I got your email, and then got a hardcover copy, and then a few more that I bought to give to my children. So needless to say, I like this book. Let me jump in about the book here a second. But before I do, we've been in touch with each other over a number of years. I remember getting an email from you when you were going off to become Barack Obama's ambassador to Sweden. And I'm just trying to remember how we first ran into each other online. Do you remember?
I'm trying to remember too, because I don't think I was not on social media back then. So I need to find whoever connected us and thank them, because I have so enjoyed this pen palship and friendship over, I mean, that was 12 years ago.
Yeah, because the thing is, I got an email out of the blue from you from Sweden saying, I've just been appointed ambassador to Sweden. I know that your daughter lives in Finland. Next time you get to Scandinavia, stop by and be our guest. And this was when you were the ambassador. And I guess Brooke, your wife, was over there with you at that time.
Yeah.
And then soon after that, you were appointed to London, to the Court of St. James, I guess is the official way to.
Well, that is the official way. And then this important interlude in between, Frank, because I had just started to feel like I was getting decent at my job in Sweden. And then I get a call from President Obama asking if I would please come home to chair his finance efforts on his reelection.
On his reelection.
So of course, and he was very sweet to be like, you don't have to say yes, no pressure. But I mean, you sort of have to say yes. I was serving at his pleasure in the Sweden role. I felt I should go serve in wherever he thought was most useful. So we sort of yanked the family back to the US, and then we did that for 2 years and then went to serve in London.
Yeah. And one of the things that you did in the UK that was notable, and you talk about in the book at some length, is all these meetings you did with school kids in both public school, private schools in the UK, which of course they are called public schools. And you worked with teenagers. I think you did more than 200 sessions in schools. And this was more or less of a first for, I think, any US ambassador anywhere, unless I've misunderstood something, but I'd never heard of anything like this. And the British media picked up on it, and you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think going to schools certainly is not new. I think diplomats have been doing that for a long time. And what was interesting, though, Frank, was that when I arrived, this is now 2013, I arrived in London, and the wonderful people at the Pew Charitable Trust that does all that great research, they issued some big report, and it surveyed 40 countries around the world. And it asked basically what young people's, how much did they like America, not like America, or sort of somewhere in the middle. There was only one country where young people, I think they defined it 25 or younger, had a lower opinion of America and what we were up to than their parents and grandparents. And you can imagine that one country where the young people didn't like America as much was the UK. So I thought, okay, well, here's an opportunity. And one thing I didn't know what the right answer would be. I knew that they didn't want to go hear a lecture on foreign policy from an ambassador. so I was determined not to sort of lecture and leave. And so what I did was I brought a blank index card and an embassy pencil to each session, and we'd have about 100 students at a time. And by the end, we did get to 200 schools. So that's 20. So I have 20,000 index cards in my attic above me.
Yeah.
And I would ask these young people, all right, please draw me a picture of something that frustrates or concerns you about America. And they would do it. And then we would talk about it. And then with 5 minutes left, we had about an hour. With 5 minutes left, I'd say, okay, flip over the card, write something that inspires you or gives you hope about America and what we're up to. So we did those sessions. My wife's an art therapist. So
Yeah.
I didn't call it art therapy. I think that would have been creepy to them.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what we ended up doing. And we spent most of the time, as we should, on the hard stuff. And they wanted to talk about guns. They wanted to talk about racism. They wanted to talk about police brutality. They wanted to talk about healthcare. I mean, all these things. And by the way, almost none of them, and I remember sharing this with President Obama and with Secretary of State Kerry, none of them are what we as diplomats are trained to talk about, which is foreign policy.
Yeah.
And so the big light that went off for me, Frank, was our domestic policy is foreign policy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they are forming opinions about our country, and how do we build trust, respect, and understanding between these two countries, and being honest about where we disagree or are confused or frustrated seemed like a good place to start.
And I think you mentioned that you probably interacted with about 20,000 students in total in all those schools, and that predominantly they had a lot of issues, but one of the things that kept popping up was the gun culture in the US, and you tried to explain something about that to them in terms of your own experience. But then, of course, I guess when it came to, semi-automatic weapons and high-capacity magazines and this kind of stuff, they found this kind of shocking in the way a lot of Americans do too.
It is. I mean, it's so tricky to talk about guns just within our own country.
Yeah.
But with British, so at first I sort of was like, well, that's too complicated. And then I was like, well, no, look, we have to talk about it. And I'm no expert.
Yeah.
But and I would tell them, I was like, look, it's deep in our national consciousness and our national myth. And I don't mean myth in a derogatory way. I mean, the stories we tell ourselves. And it's like, we won our independence from you guys with guns that we weren't supposed to have and that they tried to take away. So that is deep in our thing. That's why we put it. And weirdly, they know a lot of our Constitution, which is amazing. I mean, they know about the Second Amendment. And they know about the First Amendment. And so we would talk about that. And then we talk about the Third Amendment, which kind of nobody knows. I mean, no, but the third one is the one about you cannot quarter troops in your house.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is just sort of funny. So, and the way I described the Second Amendment as an oversimplified way of doing it, because of course the Second Amendment has the right to bear arms in order to form a militia.
Yeah.
And I said, well, if you can think about the debate in America, some people think about the Second Amendment as basically being like the First Amendment, a fundamental protection against government encroachment on free speech and religion and all those things in the First Amendment. Others look at it sort of more like the Third Amendment. It's sort of like quaint and archaic, like, oh, come on, we don't quarter troops in your house anymore. We don't have militias anymore.
We do, but not the way they mean it.
Well, exactly. We don't in the way they mean it. And so, and I would explain that, we have 100 million gun owners in America. And I'm one of them. And that would always make, and I was like, because I go hunting. And anyway, without getting into all of it, it became interesting. And I wasn't trying to win an argument and convince them that our system was perfect, but just to acknowledge the really different place our countries came from with respect to guns. And I said, and look, and this is something that I think isn't, I mean, if you look at what Republican voters, independent voters, Democratic voters, they really believe that we can do a better job. 30,000 people dying every single year, 20,000 dying by suicide and 10,000 dying by homicide is way too many. And that number we're stuck at that number. And you think about when I grew up, Frank, and similar to you, I forget, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but automobile deaths were, I think 50,000 or something.
Yeah, there was 55,000 a year.
Yeah. And it's like, and now through a whole bunch of education and safety and technology, a whole bunch of things we've brought that number way down.
Right.
And people can still drive, and they haven't given up their freedom we love cars in this country. And why are we so stuck on guns? Couldn't we try to bring those numbers down while still protecting the Second Amendment? So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
So you had a good
Returning-
discussion with it.
We had a good
I was touched by the story in there about Brooke, your wife, and her being an art therapist, and then you using that. So now I'm going to dig into the book a little more in order. By the way, you had not so much of a foreword, but a little introduction written by Simon Sinek. Is that how you say his name? And he's the publisher, right? I mean, this is a book.
Yeah, he's the godfather of this book.
Yes.
That is my unofficial title for him. He's a remarkable author. He sort of hit the consciousness of people around the world with this TED Talk that went viral called Start with Why. That so often we're like, what? And he's like, start with why. These great leaders have figured that out. Then how, then what?
Yeah.
And followed it up with many wonderful books. Leaders Eat Last, The Infinite Game is his most recent one.
Right.
And so we hit it off, introduced by an Air Force attaché over in London. He came and spoke with the embassy. We really hit it off. And then he teamed up with his publishers at Penguin Random House. And said we should do an imprint together. So he's kind of co-publisher along with the wonderful folks at Penguin.
That's what I understood.
So that's why he wrote a foreword.
Yeah, he writes a good line here that begins it. And he says, over the past few decades, our society has over-indexed on rugged individualism. And then he goes on and talks about images of, the lone cowboy, the hero, and this kind of thing. You go into your book after that. And at the beginning in your introduction, you sort of extend on what he's saying. And you say, so it's surprising how many of us get up every day to do exactly that under the banner of leadership. And that is pretending is exhausting. Pretending that we know the precise destination, what steps in what order are required to get there, and how any unexpected obstacles can be cleared away as we drive toward an inevitable successful outcome, all the while projecting supreme confidence. The rest of the book, if I can put it this way, takes apart that idea of supreme confidence and puts forward an idea of paradox and unknowing and uncertainty as a better leadership method, because it pulls other people in with their opinions. And then the big example, the overarching example you use is the pyramid shape on the dollar bill, as opposed to the idea of the constellation of stars of the first 13 states. And that sort of runs through the whole book. So after you go a little further here, you get down onto another page, I think, or in the introduction again, and you say, we think we must hoard power before someone else takes it, and that we must lord it over others. We've not only come to value the consolidation and preservation of power as the best kind of leadership, we've come to believe it's the only kind. It is leadership, that it is leadership. So if you had to sum up this idea of giving away power in terms of this constellation rather than the pyramid, and you use the idea of, you show Roosevelt, choosing the pyramid coming up to wartime, a more authoritarian structure. How would you demonstrate that in terms of the overarching argument of the book? How would you sum that up for someone if you're just sitting next to them on an airplane? Because I've got some good ideas about it. I want to get into it. But I'd like to hear yours first.
This is so great, Frank, because you've given me the ability to do an airplane pitch, not an elevator pitch.
Right.
Which is better because I don't know, it's longer. No, but I'll try to do it quickly.
You don't have to do it quickly. I just really want to hear.
Well, and thank you for your. So
here it is again, everybody. Go buy this book. But in the meantime, let's just give you the chance to give us an overarching kind of sketch of it.
Sure. I just bumped into, if I had bumped into the following quote before the book, it certainly would have been in there at the beginning. I just learned this yesterday through a friend who had read the book and sent me this quote. The soul never thinks without an image. The soul never thinks without an image. Aristotle said that. He was a smart guy. And I think he's right in the sense that we have these images in our mind about ourselves and the world around us. And in the book, I say there's a pyramid way of thinking about ourselves and the world around us, and a constellation way. They aren't the only two, but they are these, I think, defining ones. And the pyramid, the obvious pyramid, is and the world of top down. Now, I think most of us sort of got the memo, so to speak, that like barking orders from the top is no longer effective, right? And so what we do is we turn often to like, I know, we'll do the opposite. We'll be bottom up. And that does feel better for a few seconds. But I don't think bottom up is any better, or bottom up is just as bad, because it forces you into one of two modes. If you think I'm going to run a bottom up campaign, you either think other people around you are beneath you, or you think you're beneath someone else. It forces you into that mode. It is the exact same shape. It is the pyramid in reverse.
Yeah.
So if you want to escape, and by the way, it is easy to point fingers at like big business, big government as sort of obvious pyramids, bureaucratic ones. But I think, and what I've learned from a lot of leaders that I talk about in the book, is that that this pyramid thing isn't out there. It begins inside each and every one of us. And the little exercise that I love to do and encourage others to do to get at how it lurks within us is, if you get to keep the math simple, get 10 people, now that we're allowed to go see people again, you get 10 people together and you say, what's the opposite of winning? And they'll all say in unison, losing. But that's just kind of a trick to warm them up. And then you say, now, the more interesting question, what's the opposite of winning and losing? 9 out of 10 of us will basically say, and I've done this a lot, I don't know, sitting it out, not playing, right? That's 9 out of 10 of us. 1 out of 10 of us says playing, or being, or loving, or learning, or laughing, or all these other things that we do in life that don't lend themselves to winning and losing. And that, and the happy bit, I think, is that once the other 9 of us hear that answer, we're like, oh yeah, right. Of course, the opposite of winning and losing. I mean, if you're not winning and losing, you're doing nothing. It's like, no, you don't win marriages, you don't win relationships, you don't win your career, you don't win parenting. In the case of marriage, you could certainly lose one, right?
Yeah.
But you can never win it. And yet that pyramid mentality, top down, bottom up, win, lose, up, down, in, out, ranking, rating, sorting, sifting, that is exhausting. There is a time and place for it. We can talk about that later. It's good in times of national crisis. Wartime demands it, not only it, but that. But it does offer stability and order. It's just not the only way of getting stability and order, which brings you to the other side of the dollar bill and our national logo. And right above the eagle's head is this thing that I've looked at a million times. You probably have too. If you have a US passport, it's more prominent on the passport.
Yeah.
It was a really important symbol for the people who came up with it, way back when. They came up with the motto, e pluribus unum, from many one. This is the symbol that goes with that. It literally, so that motto is right below the constellation. From many stars, one constellation.
Yeah.
And that's how you can get unity without demanding uniformity.
Yeah.
And the essence of it, if I'll stop with this, in the pyramid mindset, you either fit in or you are left out.
Yeah.
In the constellation mindset, you can be yourself, a star, see others around you as a star, and then by making constellations and connections, make something more useful, more powerful than you ever could alone.
Yeah.
So in a constellation, you can stand out and fit in at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I think we need to do more of. And the word, the technical word, which I'm curious for your listeners, it's a loaded word. And I use it in the book, but I use it mindful that it is often misinterpreted, which is, it is interdependence.
Yeah. And I like that.
And I do too, but it's an active choice to be interdependent, not some passive, like, oh, we're all connected in some vague and abstract way. This is an active thing. Just like if you point to a real constellation, if you teach your children, whoever first showed you Orion's belt, there it is. Once you're shown it, you can't unsee it, but the lines aren't there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You have to be shown them and then choose to see it that way, and then you can't unsee it. And it's similar
with the interdependence. Speaking of which, I come up to a quote here to set that up, and we did not rehearse this. I just happened to have my thumb in that page. Namely, how to have order within our company's committees and communities without hierarchy and strict authority, and how to have freedom without inefficiency or even chaos. The founders soon recognized that independence was the easy part and learned to give expression to something harder, but much better, interdependence. And in so doing, they handed down a powerful symbol for the mindset needed to attain it. That's how you set it up. What you were just talking about, you set it up in your book. One thing that interests me, and this is just sort of a side issue in reading this, as someone who's read quite a bit of history by different authors, and I don't know how you'll take this, but when you get into writing history, which you do actually in this book very effectively, for people who, when you read this book, my listeners, which you will, because it's a great book, you do not want to miss it. It's an important book. You're going to find that Matthew Barzun writes history very well, and you're probably going to ask the same question I do, which is, when are you going to do your version of Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples? Because you get into that. You have a real knack for, there's really two books here. There's actually three. There's your thesis about interdependence and constellation. That's the first book. There is a really good thumbnail history of the United States in terms of the procedures that gave us these two forms of government, the interdependence and the constellation versus the pyramid top-down scheme, and how this plays out through history. But then there's a treasure in this book, and I'll get there in a minute. You rediscover and reanimate some people who have been forgotten, important people we'll get to in a moment, where I think you really show that what real historians do is not tell you about all the people you already know about. They bring forth something that has been forgotten, or someone is no longer hot or no longer remembered. And you do that for a number of people. So I hope that you all, when you think about what you're going to do next, besides politics and running for office or whatever you're thinking of doing, at some point you need to write a good brief history of the US and its formation from your point of view, but also do what you've done in this book, which is to bring forth some people we've really forgotten. So one of the things I enjoyed a lot about reading this book was getting to the sections where, and by the way, this is the dollar bill and all that stuff is pictured in the book here, so that those diagrams you talk about are all here. To be clear, there was no conscious decision to push the United States in a new hierarchical direction under the banner of the monolithic symbol, but FDR's choice commemorated a very real change rapidly taking place in the American mindset. So talk a little bit how we went from that constellation idea of interdependence to this FDR moment when he's reacting to fascism and the Depression and all the rest of it.
Exactly. Well, first of all, thank you I love your characterization of the three books, or the three kinds of things within it. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think you may be right. So I mean, so the founders make this logo, right? And it took longer to design that logo than it did to win the war. And that story,
which I love, by the way. I found that very amusing and true to life when I read that.
Thank you. And it was a little bit of a risk, because chapter 1 is pretty heavy on the history, and a bunch of my friends who read it were like, hey, I know what comes next, but some people may not want to stick out this history bit to wait for the thesis stuff that comes later. So I hope readers will bear with the history and to get to the sort of, because I think it's very practical and tactical in each of our lives and what we could do sort of beginning tomorrow to make more power together. But anyway, they designed this logo, and early on they decided it ought to have two sides to it. And then I won't go into the whole story now, but they come up with the constellation, they come up with the pyramid, they come up with the motto that we talked about just now. Now, for 150 years, no one ever knew that the back even existed. They never printed it. They never made a stamp of it. They never used the back, which is where the pyramid is, and that pyramid representing consolidated power. Up until the depths of the Depression, when this guy who works for FDR is kept waiting by the Secretary of State. So he's just flipping through this book, which tells about the history of the Great Seal of the United States. And he's like, who knew? And the Latin on the back, and I'm not going to try to do it justice here, the Latin motto on the back, it could be loosely interpreted as sort of, well, it's a new order for the ages.
Yeah.
And they were trying to get the New Deal passed. So he's like, ooh, this boss is going to love this. And his boss, FDR, did love it. And so he wants to get the back of the seal out there sort of in the American consciousness. And so the Treasury brings him, and you just showed those $2 bills. They bring him one, and as you would if any of us were designing it, they put the front first.
Yeah, which is, and just
then
to show that here,
yeah,
there's the pyramid, and then there's
the constellation. So on the dollar bill, they put on the left, which is sort of first, if you read left to right, as we all do, they put the front of the seal and then the back of the seal. And FDR approves the dollar bill, except you see his handwriting. He says, it's fine, but put the pyramid first.
Yeah.
Which I thought was and again, because he's looking around consolidated business.
Yeah, exactly.
And people were really suffering. And he's like, we need to fight consolidated power with consolidated power. Right.
Yeah.
That was his hunch. And it served him well through the Depression, then through World War II, then through the Cold War, national emergency, international emergency, and that served us well. And then I think there's this time in 1989 where the wall comes down, the Berlin Wall comes down, the World Wide Web goes up, and there's all this sort of hope and promise of like, where are we going to go now? And it seemed like kind of a jump ball, so to speak, of which way we're going to go. Are we going to put the constellation first again, or are we going to stick with the pyramid? And that's, I think, this time we're all going through now, where we feel unbelievably connectable through technology, right? But disconnected. So there's that paradox, highly connectable, never been more disconnected. And the disconnected part is if you get rid of the pyramid, but you don't replace it with anything else, it's just like, oh, we're all a million stars in the night sky. You're on your own. Yeah. And that's loneliness and alienation.
Well, and there doesn't seem to be these days a cohesive vision to which we all subscribe, in the same way that there's not a daily newspaper on your front lawn anymore, or a nightly news program that everybody kind of watches for information. So I think it's gone to the next step, which is not only are we alone and not connected, we've been able to build private universes. In other words, only subscribe to the ideas with which we already agree and have those reinforced. And of course, the big tech companies' algorithms make sure that happens even more so. So how do you see, as a kind of as an interregnum here on the discussion of your book, how do you ever see putting that back together in this country in any practical way, given where we are? And this isn't about how do we compromise with Republicans or the right or the left. I'm talking about a bigger issue of how do we break out of this environment of each living in our own little closeted space with information that we agree with and hearing absolutely nothing else these days.
Yeah, I mean, my mind goes right to this amazing woman who is in the book. She's the sort of matron saint, as I think of her.
Yeah, she's right there.
She's Mary Parker Follett. And so many listeners will have heard of Peter Drucker. Yeah. Right. Who got famous by saying in the 1950s, working with General Motors, wonderful, sort of the number one, all the business gurus were asked by Harvard Business School. Yeah. It was like in 2003, they asked 200 global gurus, who is your guru? And number one on the gurus list is Peter Drucker. Yeah. And he got famous by management by objective, right? Yeah. Which sounds like the 1950s, management by objective. And then he later wanted to clarify because people really ran with it. And he's like, hey, that works really well if you know what your objective is. Yeah. Which you generally know 10% of the time. So in other words, 90% of the time, you don't know what you're trying to do. Anyway, his guru, so this is now the guru's guru, is this woman largely lost to history. He said that she'd been erased from history.
Yeah, and by the way, one of the great discoveries in your book, because she shows up, I think, at about page 48, and then you develop quite a story about her, which continues to pay out then through the rest of the book. She almost becomes your guru in this book in a philosophical sense. Thank you for bringing her to my attention. I had never heard of this woman.
Well, thank you to the people of the community of Wikipedia, who are just remarkable women and men who, largely unknown to many of us, whose work, so I'm just cruising around reading about Peter Drucker, and then I stumble upon her, and then I read this amazing biography. I encourage you to, Joan Ton is her name, and she wrote a biography of Mary Parker Follett, which is beautiful. Yeah. And I got really into that, and then I read Follett's books, and anyway, but to sum it all up, she was this amazing thinker and an amazing doer. She's living in Boston. She throws herself into the reform movement. The first thing she does is she starts a debating club. to help
And
immigrant
just
kids.
give us a year. When is this happening?
So she's born 1868. So we're recovering from the Civil War.
And then she lives all the way through to the 50s, right?
No, dies in 1933. So
Oh,
she's
33.
sort of,
That's right.
so call it 1900 to 1925-ish.
Okay.
She is those 25 years, first 25 years of the 20th century.
Yeah.
She is on the front lines of social reform work and civic work. So
Yeah.
like Boston, every civic subcommittee, she raises her hand for. So by the end of 25 years of serving on the front lines, she has this epiphany. She writes her second book. First book
Yeah.
she wrote as at what became Radcliffe, about power in the House of Congress. But and she is writing, call it 1925-ish, about a country, America, coming out of a global pandemic, raging debates about immigration, about fear of big business, about a twin fear of overregulation by government,
Yeah.
social, economic, racial division everywhere she looked. And that all, like today, can feel just intractable and overwhelming and big. And she
Yeah.
agrees. And I think her genius was, and we can begin to do something about it. We can begin to start healing by something really small, which is how we behave and interact with each other at the next meeting we have. And that's how she said, no. And she's like, she had like a PhD in meetings, right? And she's like, I have seen how in every single meeting you can either, and this is sort of, if you go to the title of the book, The Power of Giving Away Power.
Yeah.
As you'll see at the end of this, it's like the real thing is the power of giving away power so that you get it back again, so that you give it away again, so that
Yeah.
but that's a mouthful. But it's not just give it away and hands off. So here's what she says practically. She says, there are 4 outcomes of a meeting and only one of them is worthwhile. Bad outcome number 1, you, Frank, come in and try to win the day. You win your idea. You come in with an idea and you want to leave with everyone that's supporting that. And she says, well, that's no good. Why did you even have anyone else to the meeting?
Yeah.
What did you get from them? Bad outcome number 2, the opposite of that. You just acquiesce and you're like, oh, Matthew or Martha seem super pushy. Just let them have their way. No, you're denying the group a unique perspective, namely yours.
Yeah.
Bad outcome number 3, and you touched on this. This is really hard for all of us because we are told our whole adult lives anyway, and as children, that compromise is a good thing. And she says, not really. She's like, compromise in a meeting is just little mini victories and little mini acquiescences. Best case, you leave with a partial victory, but nothing more than that.
Yeah.
So she thinks the only worthwhile outcome of a meeting is co-creation, that you as a group have made something together. And we all know that feeling, I think, right? It doesn't have to be some momentous thing. You have made a determination, you have made a product, you have made a whiteboard drawing of what might become a product. I mean, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
When you have made something with another group of people, you are forever in it. It is forever in you.
Yeah.
You are not diminished. You haven't lost a bit of yourself. You haven't been absorbed into it. You're actually enhanced by it.
Yeah.
As everyone else is in that meeting. And so as I reflect on this, to your big question about what do we, each of us, start to do wherever we might be, and it's like at the next meeting, I think we can, from Follett, take in 3 expectations. Number 1, expect to be needed. By all means, bring your full self. No one else can bring that but you.
Yeah.
Number 2, expect to need others. And the most important of all is expect to be changed. Right? So that first obligation or first expectation about bringing your full self, it comes packaged, she says, with a reciprocal obligation. Bringing your full self is not sufficient. If you have succeeded as a group of making something together, you should be a different person leaving that meeting, just a little bit different. And so will everyone else. So the next meeting you go to, the full self you bring is a different self. And if you could repeat that pattern again and again, you could start to make change
Something
within
changes.
an organization. It does. You change.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
become more you with and through other people.
Do you think she kind of disappeared from the scene mostly because she was female, a woman in a man's world, business, self-help?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, there's no question sexism is an enormous part of it. Peter Drucker says in the essay that he wrote about her towards the end of his career,
Yeah.
He says, look, he acknowledges that too. He's like, I think there's something more going on than just the rank sexism of the day.
Yeah.
And he says she was actively erased,
Yeah.
not just ignored.
That stuck in my mind. Now, who did the act of erasing of?
Well, she dies the very year that FDR puts the pyramid first on the dollar bill.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, people are understandably, the depths of the Depression, everyone gets into survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
The pyramid provides order and comfort of a stabilizing type, not the only type, but a stabilizing type. And they sort of, every person for themselves. So you either get into independence mode, leave me alone, or dependence, let me be part of a small tribe. And you start to lose the habits of interdependence. Yeah. Which is the best idea America's ever had.
Is interdependence.
Is interdependence. And I say, and I know it won't happen, we're about to celebrate, and I love it, Independence Day. Wonderful. Yeah. Any band of revolutionaries can declare independence. They do it all the time. Yeah. Our genius, and again, we fell short. It's an idea. We fall short then, we fall short today. But this idea that you can be at once, a star and fit in part of something bigger, stand out and fit in. And the habits that go along with that is our best idea. How can you be a small state, Rhode Island, and they were a big state like New York? That is the best idea we've had at any scale.
Yeah, and when you look at the difference between, I guess, the fundraising at the beginning of the Obama campaign in the book, I'm talking about what you do. And in that context, it was how to win and become the nominee rather than Hillary Clinton being the nominee. And then later in the national campaign and then for re-election. There, I think you also saw a little bit of a drift back from the more constellation, collegial interdependence to more just sort of big time ordinary politics in that arc of one presidency. Did I read something into your book that isn't there, or was that there?
No, it's there. And I saw it. I see this pattern a lot. In the early .com days, I didn't have the name for it then, but just sort of a magical constellation of people we didn't even know contributing user reviews. This was CNET.com, sort of early computer magazine, but online. And just wonderful people. Now we know Wikipedia, so we see the power of what people contributing something without being physically paid for it, but because they cared about it, all the energy that lives there. We were benefiting from all of that. Yeah. And then we sort of lost our way. We went public. We had lots of money. We started getting cocky and thinking we were the gatekeepers of good information, whereas we were actually the enablers of the good information that lived with smart consumers and members of ours all around the world. Right. Anyway, that's sort of another story. So you can lose it. A constellation can be turned into sort of calcify into a pyramid quite easily. And less dramatically and differently, I think the Obama campaign in 2008, you talk to anyone involved with that, it was, it just was a wonderful and sort of energy and power producing thing. And it was wonderful to be part of, and people sort of get, like I just did, sort of, it just is a wonderful thing. In the re-election, and that was all about multiplying, right? It just was like a different, there's no way, if you think about who we were up against back then, you would never be satisfied with having a subset of your potential supporters support you. Yeah. He started his campaign with something like, and I think it was undeduplicated rather, like 10,000 possible supporters. Right. So if he ended up with a subset of that, he's doomed. So he was in the multiplication game from the beginning. Yeah. He was up against Hillary Clinton. She had a much larger list. She ended up sort of getting a subset of that, which was an impressive number. Yeah. But once you start,
she's stuck with the old way of doing things.
Yeah.
More.
And so if you, but anyway, in the re-election campaign, and I'm very proud of the work we did and the team I worked with. I think that's important to say. And I'm so glad that we did this hard work and that we prevailed, that worked out, but it wasn't magic. It was the opposite of, it just was, we worked backwards from a set destination we wanted. Yeah. And a symbol of this was, we used to have this wonderful field organizing team that I talk about in the introduction that was just sort of the heart and soul of that campaign. Yeah. And it was renamed in the re-election Team 270. Now this is kind of arcane,
Yeah.
but it was team 270 electoral votes,
Yeah.
meaning team chin the bar, don't do anything, you know. And the campaign poster in the first campaign was respect, empower, include, which doesn't need a lot of description, right?
Yeah.
And that was not designed by headquarters. That was done by a wonderful team in Iowa, and it spread everywhere naturally because it's a wonderful 3 words.
Yeah.
Just in case you didn't get it, when you walked into the Obama headquarters in the re-election campaign, we had reproduced it. It said, respect, empower, include, win.
Yeah.
And that sort of sharpness and working backwards, we were content with a subset of supporters, a subset of voters could get us over the line, and it did. But it's not the same.
But it's a different thing.
It's a different pattern and a different tone.
At the beginning of our discussion, I'm talking with the former ambassador to Sweden and the United Kingdom, Matthew Barzun, who's written this fantastic book here, which I've got tons of notes in. The Power of Giving Away Power. It's in your bookstores. Earlier, we had a little bit of a technical glitch at the beginning, so I kind of dove back in where we were. I just need to say once again that Matthew Barzun is a writer, but he also was a diplomat and ambassador in the United Kingdom, made a lot of waves and a lot of history before that by helping Barack Obama get elected. Beginning all the way in his primary campaign against Hillary Clinton, and then through the second election in the re-election. So, Matthew, you have as kind of a hands-on involvement with American history now, as someone who helped put a president in the White House and then became one of his ambassadors to 2 different countries. When you look back at that as the context for this book on the power of giving away power, I'm sort of in the middle of talking about the book, but I have an overarching question which came to my mind when I finished the book. And that was that if I was someone running a political campaign now, I could either look at your book as a call to actually change the way I'm doing things in my life and in my campaign or my business or my family, or as a clever method to get people to do what you want by listening, quote unquote, and then doing exactly what you were going to do anyway, but now they feel they've had some input. And that's one way this book could be taken. I know that's not your intent, and that's not where your head or your heart is at, but a cynic would look at it and just say, okay, you know, here's someone who's had some power, privileged background, presidential, everything, knows all these guys. You know, the elites are always looking for another way to make sure that they can bring everybody along with them. Why not pretend you're listening to everyone and doing something collegial and constellation-like? And in the end, you know, it's still the editorial board of the New York Times is going to decide what they're going to do. And, you know, whoever owns the paper at that time is going to appoint the editor. You know, we live in a pyramid scheme. How do you actually change this besides talking about it?
Look, well, 2 parts. I mean, one, I think that your challenge on the sort of listening thing is spot on, Frank. And I am, and that word, and I love the word, and I tell the story in the book when Obama gave it as a simple 1-word advice to me before I became a diplomat. And it was wonderful advice, and I tried to follow it. I think when I hear about a politician going on a listening tour,
right,
I am skeptical. I try not to be cynical. I'm certainly skeptical because so often it is just what you described. It's like they know what they're going to say and when they want to launch, and they just have to go to every county or every precinct or, you know, some sort of stunt. I think voters are pretty good at picking up on that. So in the book, I try to sort of expand it. I don't know if this is going to work in non-visual form, but as I tried to sort of, the mantra that I tried to bring into every encounter is it'll spell the word also, which is on purpose. So ALSO. And it's something I learned from watching Obama in a cornfield. It's something I learned from Mary Parker Follett. It's something I learned from these other leaders, the folks who founded Wikipedia. By the way, speaking of sort of, we'll get to this in a second, sort of privilege and entrenched, all of that. I mean, Jimmy Wales, a commodities trader from Alabama with his wonderful team, you know, took on one of the oldest companies in the world and the richest companies in the world. Everyone thought they were crazy. So I'll get back to that in a moment.
Which is a good story in the book, by the way.
But also is ask people about their hopes and fears. The L used to be listen, but I changed it because of the critique that you made. That listening, sort of like the word network, it's been
Yeah.
overused so much, it's kind of been dulled by corporate overuse and political overuse. So ask people about their hopes and fears. That's A. L, link it to your own.
Yeah.
S, serve that overlap of what you're hopeful and fearful about, what I'm hopeful, serve that overlap, and serve it in an open up, or as Brene Brown would say, be vulnerable, or psychological safety. Amy Edmondson, a wonderful professor, would say. And so what I like about ALSO, all lowercase, by the way, just sort of is in contrast to what so many of us, when I started the book, saying pretending is exhausting. And yet every one of us starts out thinking that's our day. So I contrast lowercase also with uppercase also, which I bet many listening here have been trained and are pretty good at the other ones too.
Yeah.
Argue, lecture, strategize, and organize.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of, that is all kind of, there's a time and place for all those things.
Yeah.
But I think it's telling that Mary Parker Follett, when she had her epiphany after 25 years of social work and civic work and writes these beautiful books, first thing she did was cancel the debating club she'd started 25 years before. And she's like, why are we using words for winning? And I would try this when I was on the Obama campaign. We'd get 100 volunteers come into Chicago and do these seminars. And as a little trick, I'd say, okay, quick show of hands, how many people here like to lose an argument?
Yeah.
No one ever raises their hand. And it's like, so why do we spend so much time and effort thinking we're in the argument winning business?
Yeah.
It's bad math.
Yeah.
It's bad math. So instead of that, it's why I didn't lecture the kids at the high schools. They don't want another lecture.
Yeah. When you were in the UK, we're talking about how you visited all those schools.
Yeah. And so anyway, so I like to sort of write as a cheat sheet at the beginning of the meeting. I write the also ask, link, serve, open up. It's my quirky little mantra. It may work for others. It may not. But to your bigger question and challenge, I think the Wikipedia story provides a really good one, how this is not entrenched power. Microsoft, brilliant engineers, they could see the power of compression. This is when they're trying to do the best.
Sure.
And for like six months, they beat Britannica and had the best encyclopedia in the world.
Right.
Encarta, which younger listeners will not remember, older ones like us will. They could see the power of hyperlinking, the power of search, the power of video compression. Frank, they could see the power of almost everything except for one thing. You or me or anyone listening to this show. And the idea that you would open up a system where you would pay no one to use it, charge no one to use it, pay no one to contribute it to it. Someone could write just a sentence, someone could write a paragraph, someone could edit it, and that you could collaboratively build encyclopedia articles. This is the largest human transfer knowledge engine in the history of the world.
Yeah, and sort of strangely unsung too. It's
I
a
think
much
strangely
bigger.
unsung. And teachers, I was using it. I told one of our youngest child a couple of years ago, I was like, he was asking me about something for school. And I was like, well, start off by Wikipediaing it. He's like, Dad, you can't say that. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, we can't. I was like, I know you can't use it as a source.
Yeah.
But by all means, but it's the best place to find sources. It's how I found Mary Parker Follett, because everything needs to be referenced at the bottom. So I think it's an amazing tool. And self-correcting, and imperfect, highly imperfect. Speaking of, know that.
Yeah, speaking of Follett, you say Follett called for repersonalization to bring the right kind of struggle to each encounter. In what became her standard presentation, she encouraged leaders to allow all members of the team to share their views and study the problem at hand from many angles, with each person bringing their knowledge to the table. And she called it power with, not power over. I thought that was a really good way to sum up, why you include her so heavily in the book, but also just really what she was talking about.
Well, that's right. And it reminds me that we were talking earlier, it's like back to the pyramid sort of, it's like, okay, so people get that like lording power over is not such a good, over other people isn't such a good idea. Hoarding it all to yourself isn't so great. So the next temptation, this is kind of like compromise. The next temptation is to be like, I know, we'll share it.
Yes.
But sharing it is, I know what I mean. I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. I don't think that's right. It sort of implies that there is a finite amount of it, and now we are divvying it up.
Yeah.
And with these other leaders, whether it's Wikipedia, Visa we haven't talked about, Mary Parker Follett, all these other ones who built some of the most consequential organizations and innovations, the internet, for example, that the world has ever seen, they realized that power isn't a scarce resource like something you mine. It is something you make with other people. And it begins tomorrow morning at your next meeting in that Mary Follett way. Like, you can make power with other people, and then that multiplies, and you keep that going and growing. And that's how these organizations have become.
Yeah,
really,
and you
really
discover other things, you come up with something new, you know. These discussions that we're having here today and the ones I'm having with other authors and other people who have written and done things and musicians and so forth, you know, they came out of an idea that I had in terms of trying to do a little bit of what you're talking about, rather than simply presenting, you know, well, what I'm working on now, or a new book, or this kind of thing. It's been interesting because I connected with a good graphic designer, Ernie Gregg, who is my producer on this. He and I started working together because I saw a website he had made, and it was so beautiful in the way it had been done that we struck up a relationship years ago, and then we've done online projects to go together and so forth, but only because we have both been able to work together in a creative form, which then brings a completely new thing that neither of us had envisaged, which is you and me sitting here talking today. I'm talking with
I'm
the
so
power.
glad.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it came out of, I mean, you know, what's a graphic designer and an author doing their own talk show for with other authors, not about their own projects, but about other people's projects. And Mary Follett would like that.
She would. She certainly would.
She'd think this was the way to do it.
And she'd love you holding up the book. No,
I'm holding the book up
Thank you.
unashamedly. The Power of Giving Away Power. I can't stand it. You know, I've done my own share of little things on books and so forth. And it's always like, come on, you stingy SOB, hold my book up. You know, it's like, I get so pissed off. They sort of mention it at the end of the show. It's like, hey, I'm sitting here talking about my book. I earn my living as a writer. What's your problem? Hold the damn thing up. But you have a good quote here toward about 2/3 of the way through. The pyramid mindset usually misses what cannot be measured and seeks to analyze individuals in isolation. That's why it is so ill-equipped to guide us with relationships. The magic is what happens in between. And as someone who's just celebrated his 51st wedding anniversary, because I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and now we have grown grandchildren, and I do daycare for 3 of my youngest grandchildren. My son, who was a Marine. Yeah, my son, John, who fought in Afghanistan twice and once in Iraq, came back, went to the University of Chicago, got married, lives across the street, ages 12, 10, and 7 now. And we've taken care of them since their birth. All of that has been possible because I've always looked at our family as this kind of bedrock of what you just wrote here. And I'm going to just read it again because I think it's brilliant. The pyramid mindset usually misses what cannot be measured and seeks to analyze individuals in isolation. That's why it is so ill-equipped to guide us with relationships. The magic is what happens in between. And that, you know, if you wanted to give somebody relationship advice, that's it. The magic is what happens in between. I know you're writing in a political context, but I interpret it personally.
Yeah.
And that's it. You just wrote the line. I mean, that's the thing that ought to be on everybody's.
Well, I'm so glad that resonates with you. It's and congratulations on 51 years. That is a beautiful thing, and all the hard work that goes into making a
and
marriage
lots of
work
luck
that long.
and lots of
lots
luck.
of luck.
You
Lots
got
of
to
luck.
be in the right place at the right time.
Well, that is true. And I'm reminded, I guess, in the context, not even, so there's political, there's familial. I mean, I think in business and nonprofits, that is hugely true. And I think what comes right before that in the book is there's this wonderful book. I think it is usually, you know, tied for first on best-selling business book, written by a guy named Jim Collins, called Good to Great. I don't know if you've read that.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I know of it.
Came out about at the turn of the millennium. I mean, it came out, and it's probably the book back then I had bought and given away to more people.
Yeah.
And he has a whole team of researchers, and they run what's called a management laboratory. It's a great book. And yet I sort of pick a little bit of not a pick a fight, but I have a little disagreement. So he goes in writing this book determined he's thinking about this, writing it in the late 90s. I think it comes out 2001.
Yeah.
But he is so sickened, understandably, by this sort of CEO worship, like Chainsaw Al Dunlap on the front of Forbes or Fortune or whatever,
Yeah.
just this CEO worship. He's like, this is yucky. His hunch was, I don't think what's going on at these companies is some hero CEO. There must be something else. So they do all the analysis, what companies are great versus good. But they find that there is something about these leaders of these companies that have achieved at greater, more sustained levels than these other ones. So he calls them great. There's something about these leaders. And so he and his team sit down and they're like, well, what can we call them? We have to give them a catchy name. And they try a bunch of names. And he's like, no, like servant leader. He's like, that's kind of mistaken. He's like, I don't know. They're some strange to him combination of personally humble and incredibly driven for the organization.
Yeah.
And they just call it level 5, right? And he says, one of the weird things about level 5 leaders is they don't want to be put on a pedestal. And then right after he says, he draws a pyramid with level 1 at the bottom, level 5 at the top. And I was like, you have just put them on a pyramid. That's our default image.
That's a default position.
That's the default position. Like, and they said they don't want to be on a pedestal, but by default, you stick them on one.
Yeah.
And then they say we couldn't isolate in the management laboratory what it was about these things. So that came from that. It's like, you're never going to find it in a management laboratory. You're not going to find, it's not physics, right? It's biology. It's an ecosystem. It is between the people in an organization.
Yeah.
And leadership is absolutely required, right? For all these great innovations in organizations, leadership and Alcoholics Anonymous, we talk about.
Yeah. And I thought your use of AA as a kind of a model and talking about how it formed was a really good thing in the book. I mean, that was a strong point that you were making.
Well, and it gets at, there's this wonderful story that Lynn Twist, I don't know if you and Lynn Twist, have you ever met? Anyway, another remarkable.
I don't think we have, no.
Thinker and writer like you, Frank. And she's had a huge impact on my life. She wrote a book called The Soul of Money. It's back in my house. It's not here. I would hold it up. It's a great book, and it really changed the trajectory of my life. But anyway, this particular story, she came to Louisville, Kentucky, and she told it about her own career change halfway through her life. She feels this deep calling to go help stop the devastation of the rainforest. So long story short, her organization that she's just joined has been asked to go potentially engage with this tribe that had up until this point never dealt with sort of the outside world.
Yeah.
So she does a 4-day trek to the headwaters of the Amazon to meet with this tribe and meets with the tribal leader. And she kind of says her spiel through an interpreter, and the chief listens respectively. And he says the following to her through the translator: I see. I think I understand what you mean. If you're here to help, please leave. If you are here to help, please leave. And of course, like you or me, I mean, she's just, defeated. She's exhausted. She's defeated. She's like, I blew it.
Yeah.
But then he continues, and the tribal chief says, but if you're here because you think your liberation is inexorably tied up with our liberation, then stay, let's see if we might want to work together.
Yeah, I like that.
To me, that story sticks with me because what, for me, it does is say, we are so often given these two choices. You can be totally selfish, or you could be selfless. Pick one: selfish, selfless. And what this story says to me, selflessness, sort of do-gooderism in that way, can be as destructive as selflessness.
And there's been a lot of examples of that.
There's been a lot of, look at urban renewal.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Progressive sort of, anyway, that's a whole nother story. But
well, and somewhere in the book, you talk about Moses and everybody in New York. And
and Jane Jacobs and her, standing up to that. And
she was someone else that you brought up again, like.
Yeah. But so this idea of mutual liberation, that you're not doing it to be selfish, and you're not doing it to be selfish. And this is important because I read some reviews that I think I wasn't clear enough in the book. So mutual liberation, and those words are kind of loaded. Those are wonderful words to some listeners. They turn others off. And so I have another way of trying to say it differently that I think might get at it better. But mutual liberation isn't some compromise between selflessness and selfishness. It's not a balance between the two. It is an entirely different thing. It isn't, it's active interdependence. It's all that.
Yeah.
But I got into this fun debate with a reader, discussion, not a debate with a reader about discussion with a reader. Okay, so like two cars in a parking lot. And the game is you guess the Democrat's car and the Republican's car. Each car, they're identical cars. Each only has one bumper sticker, and each bumper sticker only has one word. Car number one says freedom, car number two says together. Now, everyone sort of guesses the quote right answer, which,
Right.
you know, the Republican is the freedom car, Democrat is the together car. And in my whole adult lifetime, we have seen that freedom debate and together debate take place in our national politics. And the COVID crisis, I think, has brought out the extremes of both, although they clearly existed before. So the freedom crowd, taken to its radical extreme, is like freedom from this, just leave me alone. Okay.
Yeah.
The together thing, taken to its logical extreme, is just tell me what the heck to do. It's when they say herd immunity, they almost start to sound like we're just a herd of cattle.
Right.
Like all individuality is lost. You know, no me, just all us. And what I think is what we actually need and what we desperately want isn't freedom from, and it isn't total togetherness. It is not some big group hug. What we really want is freedom together.
Yeah.
That's what's going to get us out of COVID and building healthier. That is the American idea. Again, we fall short. The best American idea we've ever had is how we can be free together. Now, free together is maybe a better way to say mutual liberation, is a different way of saying interdependence.
Well, liberation has connotations going back into all sorts of things in the 60s.
Exactly. And you know lots about that and more than I do. So, but these words come loaded.
But I love the
And
freedom together.
I think freedom together works better.
That's a good one. You should hang on to that. I'm hoping
I'm gonna hang on to that.
I want you to run for office sometime so I can come work on your campaign in my very old age.
You were very sweet, but right now I'm not feeling that.
No, but one of these days maybe you'll be back in a position to help somebody who is again and give them some good advice, because people should read this book, The Power of Giving Away Power. I think that there's, it's always hard to tell when someone writes a book in the best of all possible worlds, how would you picture this changing things? But I don't regard your book like that. I look at this as a step. And I think it's a step to a place that will change things. Just to consider what you've considered in this book is a real gift to your reader. And I hope it goes further than that. There are some books you read and you're just saying, I hope this isn't just a book. I hope it's a thing. I hope it's a thing, like Silent Spring. Before Silent Spring, no one's talking about this. After Silent Spring, it doesn't change anything, but it makes the idea of environmental depredation a thing. And after that, it's a thing. There's no more debate. I think this book makes the idea of the power of giving away power, and the people you brought back to life in it who have been erased, this whole idea of sharing and so forth. I think there's a chance here that this book will make something a thing that should be, which is this whole issue of what do we mean by leadership? Because we've got this sort of testosterone-driven, male-centric view of things, which is really a folly. We've seen, we won't go into the weeds of the Trump years and all the rest of it, but if ever we needed this, it's now, as we dig our way back out of what I hope is an American interregnum between real presidents. So,
well, Frank, those words of encouragement mean so much coming from you. And when you talked about politics, what you just said, like a thing, that's what I want to dedicate my time and energy to that. Obviously, there are political ramifications of I care deeply about politics, but it feels like in order to make it the kind of thing, let's use that word, this is a Democrat, a Republican thing, people who are frustrated by both parties, it's not a partisan thing. And I really don't want it to be. It doesn't need to be, and it's not I hope it's certainly not intended to be some mushy middle. it's just a different shape entirely.
Yeah.
And a different mindset about yourself and those around you.
Yeah.
That I've been a witness to, and I think we're all capable of.
Yeah, one thing I like about the book too is that it's transposable into many scales. So, a couple, pair bonding, coming together, trying to start a family should read it, because this is the way you put together things that work. But, so should Sunday school teachers and pastors, and so should corporate heads, and so should people who, are trying to put together political campaigns. It's a good time to take a deep breath and think about what's in the power of giving away power, and then just say, okay, let's have an intermission here on the striving for one-upmanship. Read this book, take a deep breath, think it all over again. That's the way I see it.
Thank you. This has been so invigorating to be able to hear you play back what resonated with you.
And I've marked many more quotes than we got to time to read. I mean, the other solution is for me to just read this whole book out loud on my next thing to people, but I'm sure they're going to, there'll be a read aloud version. But in the meantime, Matthew Barzun.
Oh, there is, by the way, there is. I mean, the Audible book is out, and so I read it. So if you want to hear me read the 196 pages or whatever, that is available.
Get it on Audible. I know a lot of people who listen on Audible. And thank you very much, Matthew. I hope we can have you back. There's a lot of other stuff I want to talk about with you, just in terms of what's going on in the country.
Yeah, please. I'd be
so
honored
let's
to
do
come
another
back.
discussion sometime. Thank you.
Excellent.
All right.
Cheers.
All
Thank
right.
you so much, Frank.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.